Hey guys, the Comsh here. I'm here to talk to you today a little bit about Solemn Vigil. So let's start with the history of the card. So it came out in BRM with the two Paladin cards from BRM were this and Dragon Consort. A lot of people were really excited for Dragon Consort because it was the most obviously synergistic dragon card. Everybody was like, oh yeah, let's go play Dragon Paladin because of all these cool dragons. Now, Dragon Paladin didn't end up being super great. It's definitely not a top tier deck right now. Dragon Warrior with some of the larger dragons, Blackwing Corruptor, is actually doing a lot better. But basically, everybody was kind of on the Dragon Paladin hype train, and everybody was trying to play it. And so this card got kind of ignored and left in the dust. And I think that's a little bit of a shame because I think the card's great, and I definitely think it deserves to be played or at least tested with. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about the benefits of the card and try to convince some of you guys to maybe test it out in your mid-range Paladin decks. So, card is 5 mana, draw 2 cards, cost 1 less for each minion that died this turn. So, first of all, we're going to compare this to Arcane Intellect because they both draw you 2 cards. But first, let's take a look at if Paladin would even want to play Arcane Intellect if they had it as a class card, you know. So 3 mana, draw 2 cards. Well, mid-range Paladin is a deck that, while it can have a strong early game with things like Shielded Minibot, Muster, Knife Juggler, etc., it really focuses on the mid to late game and sort of grinding the opponent out. Now, Arcane Intellect in Mage decks right now is primarily played in decks like Freeze Mage, but it's also played in Grinder Mage, Mid-range Mage, Tempo Mage, all those kinds of mid-rangey decks that are a lot like mid-range Paladin. So if mid-range Paladin were playing Arcane Intellect, it could easily draw 2 cards and draw into some of the things it needs, because mid-range Paladin is really reliant on 2-card combos. Things like Equality plus Consecrate, or Muster plus Quartermaster, or even like Muster plus Knife Juggler. It really has some good synergy between its cards, but it needs to have more cards to do that. Also, since it tends to focus on board and sort of that kind of game, if you don't draw things like Lay on Hands, but we'll talk about that a little bit later, you can run out of gas really fast. So I think mid-range Paladin would definitely want to play 1 or 2 copies of Arcane Intellect in its deck. So let's go back to Solemn Vigil. So draw 2 cards, cost 1 less for each minion that died this turn. The cost 1 less mechanic is interesting. We haven't seen it be super exciting on cards like Dragon's Breath or Volcanic Drake, although Volcanic Drake is starting to see some play. But I think this one has particular room for abuse because it draws you cards, and anything that can get to close to free drawing you cards is a really powerful mechanic. Things like Buzzard Unleash pre-nerf or Cult Master can be really powerful if they have a good setup. I think it's pretty easy to get a good setup with Solemn Vigil because Paladin does get to make 1 dude every turn if it really wants to. A lot of time it can make more things like Muster, and it really focuses on the board. As Paladin, you spend a lot of time trading your minions or killing your opponent's minions with things like Equality Consecrate. Like, you can Equality Consecrate a board, and then you go Solemn Vigil, draw 4 cards for no mana, and still play like a 4-drop if you're at 10 mana. That's insane. So Paladin has a lot of ways to clear the board and sort of abuse the mana cost on this, which I think is really powerful. But let's talk about even if you can't reduce the cost a ton. Maybe you have 1 minion that you're trading, or you have a recruit that you suicide. You get this to an Arcane Intellect range, as we've talked about already. It's still a very strong card. Now let's talk about the potential for this card being dead. And I don't think it has any, because let's say if you don't have a board and you don't have any good creatures to play for the turn and you're looking for answers, then you just spend 5 mana to draw 2 cards. Sure, that's not great, but it doesn't really matter what the cost is because that's all you're doing for the turn anyway is drawing the cards. So even in the scenario where you don't have a board and you have like no cards in hand except this one, this card is still good because it still draws you into more cards. Now, if you have a lot of cards in your hand that you can play, but you can't reduce the cost on this, that's fine. You just play your other cards and you set up a scenario where you can reduce the cost. It doesn't matter as much when you draw the cards if you already have plays for the turn. So in that scenario, I don't really see this card being dead either. But Paladin does have a lot of ways to draw cards, so let's compare this to some of them and talk a little about it. So since this mechanic involves creatures dying, let's compare it to Cult Master, because a lot of the most criticism about this card is that wouldn't Cult Master just be better in a lot of these scenarios? So, Cult Master, 4/2, whenever one of your other minions dies, draw a card. So with Paladin, again, we talked about, a lot of times you have a board, and you can set up some pretty huge swing turns with Cult Master if you choose to play it. The problem with Cult Master is that Cult Master a lot of the time can be a dead card. They can just kill it immediately, or if you're not in a good position to trade, or if you have no board, you play this and, it's just a 4/2 and it dies basically immediately with getting you no value. So it just becomes a 4 mana 4/2. It's a very linear card and it does require you to, in fact, have a board. Solemn Vigil, despite what it might look like on paper, is actually very versatile because no matter what mana cost you're spending, whether it's 5 or 0 or somewhere in between, you're always drawing the 2 cards. It's not like Cult Master where the card advantage isn't guaranteed, so it's a lot more versatile than Cult Master, and it's going to be dead a lot less of the time, so it's a less risky card to play. Also, it combos with things like Equality Consecrate or other border wipes, whereas Cult Master does not, because Cult Master only triggers on your minions. This gets the cost reduced on all minions. So next, let's talk about Divine Favor. So Divine Favor is played a lot more in the aggro Paladin decks, which is fine because, you know, they dump a lot of small minions on the board and then they get to redraw. Divine Favor is, again, pretty linear because in things like mid-range Paladin, you and your opponent a lot of the time are going to have close to the same amount of cards in hand, or you're both going to have very few cards in hand, things like that, and then Divine Favor is going to be dead and it's not going to draw you cards. In addition, Divine Favor is always going to cost 3, just like Cult Master is always going to cost 4. This has the potential to cost less. Again, this doesn't combo with AoE as much, although Equality Consecrate does get rid of 2 of the cards in your hand, and you can replace some of them, potentially. But again, your opponent's probably going to be close to the same card count as you. In addition, this never actually puts you ahead in card advantage necessarily, unless you've dumped a lot of stuff on the board already. This will just get you to parity in terms of the same amount of cards in hand as an opponent. So even if you get to draw a lot of cards, your opponent already has a lot of cards in their hand. So the value isn't as real as it seems because their mid to late control deck will often get a lot more value off having those cards than you will if you're dumping your hand to try to play Divine Favor. Solemn Vigil, on the other hand, can get you ahead of your opponent. Since it is a 2-for-1, you draw 2 cards for 1 card. If you cast 2, then you get 4 cards for 2 cards. So it's putting you cards ahead of your opponent, even if you already have the same amount of cards in hand. So it can give you actual card advantage over your opponent, whereas this puts you in parity, at least in terms of hand card advantage. So finally, let's talk about Lay on Hands. Since this is the most commonly played card draw spell in mid-range Paladin, I do think these fulfill somewhat different roles, since this one heals you and is a lot more late-game card, takes a turn. So I think you could maybe split these 1-1 if you were going to try to play Solemn Vigil. But let's talk a little bit about just a direct comparison. So Lay on Hands, you can't really do anything in the turn you Lay on Hands. If you're at 10 mana, you can play like a mini-bot, a juggler, or a hero power in addition to this, but you can't really dig for like a board clear or cards you need. So this is a huge loss of tempo in exchange for card advantage. So if you're playing it's like an aggro deck, then the 8 health is really important. It basically stalls a turn and draws you 3 cards, so it's just a +3, which is fine most of the time. If you're playing against like a late control deck and you need to dig for threats, again, this is great. But if you're really in a board-centric battle, in a mid-range sort of battle against another mid-range deck, and you both have creatures on the board and you're trying to fight, if you spend an entire turn drawing 3 cards and you don't draw into like Equality Consecrate, then you're falling super behind on board, you're losing all your minions because your opponent gets to play out minions and do things that affect the board, and you're not doing that because you're restoring 8 health and drawing 3 cards. The only way this doesn't like put you dead on board or like sort of mess up your board position is if you draw into Equality, and that lets you trade very efficiently. But even then, that's kind of a risk. So Lay on Hands is basically a huge loss of tempo in exchange for card advantage. Solemn Vigil, on the other hand, is really great in the scenario where you both have a lot of creatures on board because you trade a little bit, you make some favorable trades, and then you Solemn Vigil. You can choose at what point you want to do that. Maybe you want to draw into some combat tricks like or a weapon like True Silver or Consecrate, Equality, etc. Basically, you got to choose at what point along the trading you got to draw the cards, and sometimes you can do it for free and still play out your minions and still maintain your board position. So Solemn Vigil is actually great in the position you're trading. It's fine when you're digging for threats because it only draws you 1 less card against like the control deck in that scenario. It is maybe slightly worse against an aggro deck, but you do get to cast it a lot sooner, especially if you're clearing like Hounds or against Zoo, you're consecrating, things like that. So it can be free a lot of the time, and having free card draw against an aggro deck is super powerful because it's scary to commit mana to something that isn't a taunt or a heal or a removal spell, and this lets you draw cards without committing mana against an aggro deck. So I think a lot of the time this is on par or better than Lay on Hands in a Paladin deck. So I definitely think the card is worth testing for that reasons. So that was a little bit of comparison of Solemn Vigil to other card draw spells. Let's talk about it a little bit in terms of the meta. So some popular decks right now are things like Zoo, Patron Warrior, Control Warrior. We're seeing a little bit of a resurgence of Druid, not a ton of mages lately. So basically right now, against things like Patron Warrior or Zoo, You get to consecrate or equality consecrate, things of that nature. You really get to clean up their board. With Patron Warrior, it would have to be equality consecrate or spell power consecrate, something like that. But basically, you're playing against a lot of decks that make a lot of minions. So you get to make a lot of trades, you get to clean up their board, and then you get to, because both Zoo and Patron Warrior have really unfair ways to draw cards. Patron Warrior has Acolyte and Battle Rage and a lot of things like that. Zoo has Life Tap, and this lets you, a lot of times for free, get back the card advantage that you're losing by them just drawing a lot of cards. So this card is really powerful, I think, in today's meta. I think it definitely deserves a slot in Midrange Paladin if that's a deck that you want to play. And while Midrange Paladin hasn't been played a lot lately, I think if you are going to play it, or maybe if it's going to make a resurgence, I think it definitely needs Solemn Vigil. So that was a little bit of my reasoning on why I think Solemn Vigil should be played. I think you guys should definitely try it out. You know, let me know in the comments if it's been working for you, etc. But I think it's definitely a card that's been underrated because of sort of the circumstances of its release, and I think it definitely deserves to be played. So that was my little spiel on Solemn Vigil. Thank you for listening, and try it out.